After 15 rounds of voting, Kevin McCarthy is finally elected Speaker of the House of Representatives. The January 6th committee releases the Social Security numbers of nearly 2,000 conservatives. The United Arab Emirates calls an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council over an Israeli politician visiting the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And Prince Harry's recent revelations and what they reveal about our society. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Welcome, friends. It is January 10th. 2023, the day after Kate Middleton's birthday, which was yesterday on the 9th. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is not just because I love Kate Middleton, but also because it is relevant to our last story of the day, which is Prince Harry's recent revelations that he has talked about in both the British and the American press. I'll just say up front that it seems to be interesting that Prince Harry decides to make these public pronouncements on dates which are important to the William and Kate cohort of the family. For instance, Harry and Meghan released their Netflix documentary trailers during the dates that William and Kate were in the United States for their climate change tour. And then yesterday, being Kate Middleton's birthday, is the day that his book Spare was released. So it does seem a little bit too coincidental and maybe like a slight, but we will talk about that in just a few more minutes. But to start off, here is the important news that you need to know today. First, we finally have a Speaker of the House. On late Friday night, after just 15 rounds of votes, Kevin McCarthy, who was a Republican from Bakersfield, California, was finally awarded the gavel. So people in the media have been saying that this is unprecedented, that it is the first time since 1859 that a House of Representatives Speaker has not been elected on the first vote. So let's discuss what happened. First, the context is important of how often elections in the House of Representatives take place. So there are 435 members of the House, and representatives only serve 2-year terms. So that means that every midterm or every general election, all of the cohorts of representatives are up for re-election. And so every 2 years, that means that a new speaker has to be elected. Now, why is the speakership so important? The reason is that the Speaker runs the Rules Committee of the House of Representatives. And the Rules Committee essentially decides how legislation gets to the floor of the House. Legislation starts in different House committees, either in the Committee of Education or Agriculture or Foreign Policy. And once those pieces of legislation spring up in the committees, then there's a procedure that is set by the Rules Committee of how they would get to the floor for a vote. So the Speaker, who is the head of the Rules Committee, gets to decide how long the debates are over certain legislation, whether there will be amendments that will be allowed to be added to pieces of legislation, what those amendments will be. So really, the Speaker of the House has the huge power of deciding the legislative agenda of the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House is elected by a simple majority vote of the representatives that are present. And that part is really important. It is only the majority of the present representatives. So if all 435 representatives are there, then the person would need 218 votes to be elected Speaker of the House. But if only 400 of the members are present, then there would need to be a majority of just 201 votes to get McCarthy elected as Speaker. So even though now Republicans have the majority in the House, they have 222 seats while Democrats only have 213, McCarthy was not elected in those first few rounds because a group of about 20 Republicans opposed his nomination. That group of 20 Republicans belongs to something called the Freedom Caucus, which people think emerged in the wake of President Trump, but the Freedom Caucus has actually been a group in the House of Representatives since the early Obama years. They're comprised of hard-lined right-wing conservatives. And right now they are run by Lauren Boebert and Matt Gaetz primarily. And the reason why they opposed McCarthy's nomination, or I should say vote to become Speaker, is because first they wanted to get some concessions out of him. And they did. The first concession that they got out of him is that it only requires one member of that Freedom Caucus to call a vote for the Speaker to be replaced. Kevin McCarthy wanted that number to be 5, so it would require 5 members of the Freedom Caucus, but the Freedom Caucus bargained him down to 1 in order to agree to vote him in as Speaker. So that was the first major concession. The second major concession is that the Freedom Caucus got some seats on the Rules Committee, and they also got some chairmanships of other various committees in the House that they wanted. The third, another big concession that they got, was that they made McCarthy agree to bring a balanced budget vote to the floor of the House, as well as votes about the border and term limits. Now, it's dubious whether those items will be voted into law because Democrats, for instance, with regard to term limits, really oppose them. But still, just the fact that the Freedom Caucus has demanded that McCarthy has to bring those items to a vote is a good thing. And then the fourth major concession that McCarthy had to give in order to be elected Speaker was a new committee that would replace the January 6th committee about the weaponization of the FBI against its political foes. So those are the 4 main things that the Freedom Caucus fought for. Now, as I indicated earlier, people have been freaking out over this speakership debacle. They have been saying, look how dysfunctional the House is. Republicans can't even elect a speaker in their first 5 days of being in charge of the House. And although those claims are a bit over-exaggerated, there is some truth to them. The truth is that the House of Representatives has been in a state of dysfunction for the past few decades. And what we have seen this past week is an aggregate of many bad reforms and choices that have plagued the House of Representatives over the past half-century. Starting in the 1970s and 1980s, there were a lot of professors and academics and members of think tanks who thought that there were certain problems in the House that needed to be remedied. The first one is they actually thought that there was too much party overlap, that the parties needed to be more ideologically distinct from one another. Now, that is nearly impossible for us to conceptualize of today, but back in the late 20th century, there were actually many liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. And the academics said that the parties need to have more firm lines between them and better represent distinct interests. So there's been a move over the past half century to make the parties more ideologically distinct. The first way that people have done that is by making it very hard for a candidate to switch parties. There are all these kinds of restrictions among states that if you previously ran as a Republican, for instance, it's hard to run as a Democrat and vice versa. And another way that we have codified among party lines is by gerrymandering, where the state legislatures, get to draw districts along party lines so that a person from a particular party will be elected for that district. So this ideological calcification is one of the ways that we have seen the House deteriorate, because now you really need the entirety of your party to vote to elect a House Speaker. None of the Democrats, for instance, voted to elect McCarthy, so McCarthy had to make all of those concessions to the Republicans in order to get the seat. Another way that the House has deteriorated, in large part thanks to the influence of academics and think tanks, is that people said that the authority in the House needed to be less concentrated in the Speaker, and that the authority needed to go to more of the members. Now, this sounds like a good talking point, but the effect of it is that Speaker McCarthy, or any other Speaker that comes into his or her tenure does not have as much authority and deference as respect, as they did in the past. So that's why you see the Freedom Caucus able to kind of play around with McCarthy and get concessions out of him because they have that power to do so. And also, another important thing before we move on from this to understand about the House of Representatives is that there has been a move away from obeying procedure, not just with electing the Speaker of the House, but also pertaining to other things such as the budget. The way that our budget is decided in this country nowadays is so different from the procedures from which it is supposed to run. The way it is supposed to run is that the president in the summer is supposed to give Congress, the House of Representatives, a proposal of a budget plan. And then members of Congress will kind of go back and forth with the president, and then they will vote on the budget in July for that upcoming fiscal year, which starts on October 1st. So before October 1st, there is supposed to be a budget plan for that entire fiscal year. But now what happens is that Congress has started to pass these omnibus spending bills every few months and weeks that just keep adding to the budget and keep increasing our debt ceiling. So they're not deciding our budget in advance, but just kind of playing along with it as they go along, which is, again, yet another example of the dysfunction of our House. But even more than what Speaker McCarthy's trouble reveals about Congress, it actually bears more significance for the state of the Republican Party. It shows that over the past 120 years, there's been sort of a civil war or a split within the Republican Party that made it be the case that Speaker McCarthy did not originally get the support that he thought that he deserved. This all starts back in the day of Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Those were two Republicans. In fact, William Howard Taft was Teddy Roosevelt's vice president. And they ended up becoming bitter enemies because they had such different approaches to conservatism. Teddy Roosevelt was anti-establishment. He was really skeptical specifically of big business and financial interests. But William Howard Taft was the opposite. He was more friendly to big business, so they had that split. In fact, when William Howard Taft became president, Teddy Roosevelt then came back and tried to run against him again, but that really started the ideological split in the Republican Party. And it continued for decades afterwards. In the 1950s, there was a split between Dwight Eisenhower and his kind of line of conservatives, again, more pro-establishment, and Robert Taft, who's actually the son of William Howard Taft, who is ironically anti-establishment, even though his father represented the pro-establishment part of the Republican Party. This also continued into the 1960s with Nelson Rockefeller, who was the more establishment guy, and Barry Goldwater, into the 70s with Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan, into the 90s with George Bush and Pat Buchanan, and even into the 2010s with Jeb Bush and Donald Trump. There really appears to be no analog to this kind of fissure within the Democratic Party. I have to hand it to them. The Democrats do have a lot of party discipline. Even when there is an argument among the Democrats, like there was between Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy or between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, when a Democrat is elected, they really do all kind of galvanize and get behind whatever the chosen candidate is in a way that the Republicans do not. Even though the 15 rounds of voting that happened this past week do reveal some dysfunction within the House of Representatives and within the Republican Party, the good news is that the Freedom Caucus did push in some good legislative concessions and reforms. So we should all be happy about that, specifically the new committee about the weaponization of the FBI. That is certainly needed. Now on to news that is way more important than whoever our Speaker of the House is. This is shocking news that came out just in the past few days, that the January 6th committee has released the Social Security numbers of nearly 2,000 conservatives, including several conservative lawmakers, such as South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster, and former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson. Now, how did they have the authority and the information that had people's Social Security numbers to be released to the public? The answer is that these Social Security numbers came from a spreadsheet that the January 6th committee collected as part of its necessary resources to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And this was a spreadsheet of all of the conservatives who visited Trump's White House at the end of 2020. So the January 6th committee had their last public meeting in late December before the committee was going to be dissolved by the new Republican House of Representatives. And they publicly released a series of documents collected as part of their investigation. And one of these was this spreadsheet. So the National Archives keeps a list of the people and the information of the people who visit the White House. And what they are supposed to do is when they send it along to something like the January 6th committee, they are supposed to remove the personal information of, like the Social Security number, of the people who were listed. But the National Archives did not do that. And the January 6th committee did not correct the National Archives' error and still released all of these Social Security numbers to the public. And it wasn't just the Social Security numbers of the lawmakers themselves, but also of their children. For example, Governor Kristi Noem has 3 children, all of whom had their Social Security numbers released, and her son-in-law had his Social Security number released, and her husband. So this raises the question, why did they do that? And it reminds me of a story that I covered, I believe it was last week or the week before, where the New York Times published a 3D image of Trump's estate in Palm Beach, Florida, Mar-a-Lago, as part of a story that they were writing of how Trump hid several classified documents in parts of Mar-a-Lago. And I'm going to ask my producers now to put up an image of the New York Times 3D image of Mar-a-Lago. Literally, it covered the entire newspaper, and they showed the archways of each of the doors at Mar-a-Lago. They identified the staircase that leads to President Trump's office. And again, they say that they were just trying to show how all of these documents were out and available in plain sight for visitors of Mar-a-Lago to see. But was it really necessary to the story to show a 3D image of the former president's house? And is it really necessary for the public, as part of the investigation into January 6th, to have access to the Social Security numbers of several lawmakers? We need to call this what it is. And what they are trying to do, it appears, is to make it easier for people to harass, and in some cases, perhaps violently harass Republicans. They want to make it easy for someone to break into Mar-a-Lago and potentially harm the former president, and they want to make it easier for someone to steal the identity or gather more information on Republican lawmakers, and this is sick. To those who believe and loudly proclaim that Donald Trump is a safety threat to our country and poses a threat to our democracy, I want to hear those people coming out against this. Can you imagine if there was a Republican committee that was investigating something pertaining to the Democrats, I don't know, maybe a Black Lives Matter riot, and they released the Social Security numbers of AOC or the members of the squad or Pelosi or any other Democratic leader? What do you think that we would be hearing? The double standard is absurd. The reason why Democrats think that it is okay to do this is because they believe that they are on the right side of history. So their rationale is, well, maybe it isn't the best thing to release the private information, the Social Security numbers of people, but those evil Republicans are so awful and such a threat to our country that they deserve it. It's the same logic of, well, maybe it's a bad thing to, have the FBI work with Twitter to suppress the speech of conservatives, but they deserve it because they're posing a threat to our democracy. But the problem is that we see throughout history the people who have been oppressors and the elite that has wielded unruly power over the the rest of their country has always been people that thought that different rules have to apply to them, that they are superior to other members of their population. Now, moving on to international news, there is a brewing religious battle between Muslims and Jews in Israel over one of the world's holiest sites, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount is a magnificent structure. It stands on a hill in the old city of Jerusalem. It's an octagonal structure that's blue and has a magnificent gold dome on the top of it, which you can see from many parts of the city in Jerusalem. It was completed in the 7th century, and there are gates surrounding it from the Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman periods. So it is quite a rich historical treasure. And it is also quite a rich religious treasure, which holds deep significance for each of the 3 Abrahamic religions which are present in the country of Israel. For Jews and Christians, they believe that the Temple Mount is where the first and second temple stood. And they believe that the first and second temple held the 10 Commandments, and it held this chamber called the Holy of Holies, where they believe that God resides. There's also a rock, which is called a foundation stone, inside this Temple Mount, and Jews and Christians believe that that rock is where Abraham bound his son Isaac to be sacrificed until the angel Gabriel came down and saved Isaac's life. And Muslims believe that that foundation stone also is the site from which Muhammad, the prophet, ascended from earth to heaven. So again, it is hugely significant to those 3 religions. Over the past 100 years, though, both the Israeli government and the religious leaders of Israel have agreed that Jews should not be allowed to enter the Temple Mount or to pray at the Temple Mount. And this is for 2 reasons. The first reason is that they believe, the first is a religious reason. They believe that the Temple Mount, as I just mentioned, is where God resides. And that in order to pray there, Jews have to be ritually pure, which many religious leaders say is not possible in modern times. So that's the first reason. And the second, and arguably more important reason, is that the Israeli government has decided to keep Jews away from that site in order not to exacerbate the already high tensions between Muslims and Jews in Israel. After the Six-Day War in 1967, the Israeli government actually took control of the Temple Mount, but within a few days they handed it back over to the Muslims because they know that it is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. The first holiest site is Mecca, the second one is Medina, and the third is this Temple Mount. So Jews going to this Temple Mount, in light of that 100-year informal policy that Jews should not go there to pray, Jews going to the Temple Mount is seen as a big affront to Muslims in the area. And it has caused a lot of violence in the past. For instance, in 2000, a member of the Israeli government named Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount, and that visit alone was one of the primary reasons for sparking the Second Intifada, which was a wave of violence in Israel that was mostly Muslim directed violence in Jerusalem, and that lasted for several years until both sides came to an agreement to ramp it down. And then in 2021, clashes between Palestinian and Israeli soldiers on the Temple Mount led to an 11-day war between Gaza and Israel. So last year, Prime Minister Netanyahu was reelected, and alongside many other right-wing leaders in Israel. And this reflects a broad trend in Israel towards a more right-wing approach to politics, where many Jews want to see a more Jewish national character return to Israel. And they say that Judaism should not be hidden. It shouldn't have to be a liability or a hazard. And if Jews want to go and visit the Temple Mount, they should have the right to do so because they say Israel's existence is to be a Jewish state. So what has happened in the past few weeks is that we have started to see a lot of Israeli and Jewish leaders start to return to the Temple Mount. We've seen some rabbis come and lead tours as well as silent prayers on the compound. One of the rabbis that has been quite outspoken about doing this, his name is Rabbi Yehuda Levi, and he claims that it is the right of the Jewish people to visit this holy site. But most famously, last week, the Israeli Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, visited the Temple Mount, which sparked the United Arab Emirates to call for an emergency meeting of the United Nations. So Mr. Ben-Gvir has a bit of a contentious history with regard to Israeli-Muslim relations. He is viewed as a far right-winger, and he once aligned himself with someone who advocated to completely expel Arabs from Israel. Mr. Ben-Gvir, for the record, has since claimed that he no longer holds that view, but still many Muslims view his presence as a threat to them. So when Mr. Ben-Gvir visited the Temple Mount last week, even though he did not pray, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority took great umbrage to this decision of his. Hamas, which runs Gaza, called it a crime, and the Palestinian Authority, which runs the West Bank, called it, quote, an unprecedented provocation and dangerous threat. So Saudi Arabia and Jordan also denounced Mr. Ben-Gvir's visit, and as mentioned, the United Arab Emirates called for an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council over this visit. This happened this past Friday, January 5th. And let's listen to what the ambassador to the United Nations from Israel said about the Jews' right to visit the Temple Mount.
When this council dedicates its valuable time to shows about nothing, it legitimizes the poison and lies of the Palestinians and as a result empowers terrorists to continue in their murderous ways. Distinguished council members, the Temple Mount holds an unmatched place in my people's ancient heritage. It is the spot upon which the Ark of the Covenant held Moses' 10 Commandments and where God resided. The status quo maintains that Jews may visit the site, and it is the right of every Jew to do so.
Interestingly, Western countries that historically would have been more inclined to support Israel have sort of come out against Israel's position on the Jews' right to visit the Temple Mount. For instance, the French representative to the United Nations urged Prime Minister Netanyahu to, quote, ensure that the status quo of the holy places is respected. And the United States deputy to the United Nations said a similar thing. So Israel in response has said that they feel alone in this fight, that they usually could rely on the United States to be their allies, but they feel sort of left out to dry. And Mr. Ben-Gvir is not stepping down from his decision to visit the Temple Mount. He said, no Israeli government in which I am a member will surrender to a vile group of murderers. He, of course, is referring to Hamas, which runs Gaza, and he, along with many other right-wing members of the Israeli government, view this as much as a religious stand, also a political stand. And moving on to more gossipy international news. In the past 48 hours, Prince Harry has done his latest press tour, both in England and in the United States, as part of a push to promote his new book, Spare. And as I said at the beginning of this episode, Spare came out yesterday, January 9th, which is Kate Middleton's birthday, so sort of a way to steal her thunder a bit. And Spare is unsparing in its details of Harry's life and his grievances against the royal family. And even though there has been a lot of information coming from Harry and Meghan about their lives over the past year, they did that Oprah interview, they also just released a 6-part Netflix series. The character of the interviews that Prince Harry has given over the past 48 hours have been a little different. And they have revealed something that we have all suspected, but now know to be true. And that is that so much of Harry's decision-making in the past 2 years has been a result of the trauma that he has endured from his mother's death. So there was a stunning revelation in a 60 Minutes interview that Prince Harry gave to Anderson Cooper over the weekend, where Prince Harry actually said that for almost a decade, he did not believe that his mother actually died. Let's listen to the clip.
You didn't believe she was dead?
For a long time. I just refused to accept that she was gone. Part of, she would never do this to us, but also part of, maybe this is all part of a plan.
I mean, you really believe that maybe she had just decided to disappear for a time?
For a time, and then that she would call us and we would go and join her. Yeah.
How long did you believe that?
Years. Many, many years. And William and I talked about it as well. He had similar thoughts.
You write in the book, you say, I'd often say it to myself first thing in the morning, maybe this is the day. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is the day that she's going to reappear.
Yeah, hope.
I don't care if you're royalty. I don't care how much money or resources you have. We all need to acknowledge that Prince Harry has suffered an unimaginable trauma that we shouldn't just brush off because he is in the position that he's in. 12-year-old Prince Harry, after his mother died, had to walk behind her casket in front of billions of people. He had to greet mourners. He even saw pictures of his dead mother in the backseat of the car where she died. I mean, that is just an unbearable thing to go through. And it is quite clear now from this revelation that he is suffering from acute trauma. It's enough to go through that and lose your mother and to have to go through it so publicly, but also to go through the mental turmoil of thinking that your mother may still be alive and out there hiding somewhere. That is just unbelievable. And it shows that Prince Harry is now putting his wife in the role that his mother used to occupy. That is an innocent person, a vulnerable person, a person who is close to Harry, a female that is close to Harry, who he thinks is being abused by the British press and by the public. And he has drawn this line between the two events clearly. He has said that his biggest fear is history repeating himself, and he does not want the same thing that happened to his mother to happen to his wife. It is understandable to many why Prince Harry has this view. But what's a bit odd about his book and his interviews is that he has gone many steps further, where he hasn't just discussed the trauma that he has endured as a result of his mother's death, but he has also talked about a litany of grievances that are really deeply personal and tawdry. I'm sure many of you know what I am talking about. I'm not going to repeat some of those details here because, as I said, they really are quite tawdry. And trust me, they are readily available elsewhere with just a simple Google search. But this story is relevant for the time that we live in for several reasons, the last of which is specific to Prince Harry. But it reflects our culture's way of publicly pronouncing trauma. In general, yes, of course, Harry has a big platform and a big name and a lot of publicity to speak to a large audience about his trauma. But in general, it is not uncommon to see people being equally as public about their grief or grievances or perceived offenses in their lives. For instance, we saw last year that Kristi Teigen and her husband posted photos to Instagram after Kristi Teigen suffered a miscarriage, and she's sitting on a gurney with her head in her hands crying, and then in another image she's sitting in her husband's arms, and she just put that very deeply personal moment of trauma out for the world to see. Even among non-famous people, we see that this is an in vogue phenomenon. It is not uncommon on Instagram to see people, for instance, holding the hands of a relative, posting a picture holding the hands of a relative who is about to die and writing a long tribute to that person. People also tend to post photos of accidents that they may have had, and again, write long messages detailing a trauma that they endured. And it reflects a modern trend to overshare personal, private, intimate, and maybe inappropriate moments for public consumption. 50 to 100 years ago, it used to be the case that people didn't talk openly about their trauma. They repressed it and they allowed it to fester. And then people started to get the idea that maybe that wasn't the best way of going about things, and that you need to talk about it publicly. So First, it became commonplace that people would talk to a therapist or a clergy person about it in a private setting. Then people sort of opened the kimono more and started talking to their friends and families. But then in the 90s and early 2000s, with the advent of cable TV and social media and the internet, people started broadcasting these traumas on quite a wide scale to get mass distribution. And what it does is that it fuels the fire of making everything in our lives be a competition. We see on social media that people like to one-up each other by posting photos of what restaurants they went to or what possessions they have or what fancy vacation they went on. And it's really no different when it comes to trauma or grievances. Everything in our lives today is part of an arms race to show one another who is living the most raw and authentic life. And what also happens is, and I just want to make clear, this is not true of Prince Harry. This specific thing I'm about to say is not true of him, but it is true of many other people. What happens is that when you commoditize suffering, people come to discuss serious matters in a flippant, casual, and offhanded way that seems inappropriate and dismissive of the things that they are talking about. And it raises the question, is this new way of going about sharing hardships, this very public, competitive, oversharing, casualizing trauma way, is this really effective in healing? And I want you all at home to ask yourself that in your own personal life, do people who do this reach a place of healing where the bad thing is acknowledged and integrated appropriately into that person's life, into their story? Or is it the case that the trauma becomes the whole identity of the person? And it leads to a final question I have about Prince Harry. He seems to be quite a fragile, vulnerable, naive person. And the question is, where does this lead to for him? What's his next move? Is his next move just going to keep repeating the move that he has already done? Is he just going to jump from another Netflix series to another interview to another book? And is he considering that he is being manipulated by the people who claim to be on his side? Unfortunately, I see a very hard road down the line for him. Thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And remember, like a sculptor starting with a block of clay and the tools to form it, each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. Thanks so much.